Over the past decade, we've seen the lasting impact of waste products on the world grow increasingly urgent, with celebrities like David Attenborough catapulting the issue into public consciousness and influencing public and organizational boycotts of single-use items such as plastic straws. Alongside waste products, we've become increasingly aware of the dangers of continuing to utilize the Earth's finite amount of materials. We know that use of fossil fuels, as well as contributing to pollution in our air, is unsustainable. It's more and more important to shift our focus to reusing, recycling, and reducing our use of those materials. Our research at the Centre shows us time and time again that the life cycle and reusability of products must be considered in business planning. Solutions instated to help create a more sustainable future could cause harm in other areas, if not thought out properly. For example, the life cycle of lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. Ensuring businesses have knowledge of what takes place within their supply chains is another crucial element which appears often in our research. Research shows that transparency and sustainability in supply chains is rapidly becoming an expectation of customers who want to know that their products were sourced and made responsibly. Building your business recovery plans allows a perfect opportunity to integrate sustainable, responsible, circular economic models.
Okay, welcome. My name's Ian Thompson and I'm the Director of Lloyds Banking Group Centre for Responsible Business at the University of Birmingham. It's my pleasure to chair this session on the potential role of circular economy and supply chain for responsible business transformation. We're at a time whenever has our interconnectivity and mutual interdependence been so visible to so many and so critical to our future. We seem to be approaching or teetering on a number of tipping points where changes seem possible and urgently needed in business practices and policies. Businesses have the capacity to do amazing things. They're world-making institutions for good and for bad. But too many businesses seem to have chosen to outsource their social, economic, and ecological responsibilities to their supply chain, somehow imagining that procurement will magically vaccinate them against the consequences of irresponsible actions. The sort of, it wasn't me, it was my supply chain that did it. And far too many businesses are engaging in self-harm, overlooking incredible value-creating opportunities through destructive, outmoded, take, make, waste thinking. I mean, how profitable is it getting stuff for free and creating value by spending less? How can businesses not be taking the opportunity to actually for mutual benefit? These two things, so circular economy and supply chain, are two very interconnected part of a bigger solution set, with many more winners than losers, but surprisingly yet to be mainstreamed. Luckily, we have a panel of experts who are thought leaders, powerful advocates for change, and leading actors in this space, who have agreed to share their knowledge and the challenges with us, providing valuable insights to help us all make a difference. So I will ask them to introduce themselves in a minute, but right now we have Kathy McAndrew, the Sustainability and Business Strategy Consultant at Accenture, who's currently the program lead for the Circulator Accelerator. We have Chris Holmes, who's Senior Vice President for Global Sourcing for Aventor. And proving we have got past the letter A in our mailing list, we have Jan Bevington, Professor at Lancaster University and Director of Pentland Centre for Sustainability for Business. I have to confess an almost 30-year fascination, obsession with this topic. ranging back to when it used to be called things like industrial ecology and cradle to cradle and cradle to grave and things like that. But I'm going to try and keep my nose out of this discussion, which is going to be very, very hard because I think it's there. Because time's short and it's about listening and trying to get as much kind of, as many kind of insights as possible in a short period. Just to let people know, I'm going to try and get as many rounds of questioners, but we want to try and cover why supply chain circular economy is important to business, the key insights from our collective experience, the biggest challenges, how businesses can start and develop their responsible business kind of circular supply chain pathways, and perhaps to look forward in time to look at what kind of changes would really kind of enable this to really to take off. So anyway, I'm going to pass over to Kathy now, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we'll start the session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ian, and such a pleasure to be here today. I'm Kathy McAndrew. As you mentioned, I work for Accenture in their sustainability strategy team, and I lead the Circulars Accelerator. So that is an initiative with the World Economic Forum, Ecolab, Anglo American, Schneider Electric, and others. And it's really about driving and supporting innovators across the circular space to scale their disruptive solutions to solve some of the challenges that we face. Aside from that, I support clients in sustainability strategies, focusing specifically on social sustainability topics and responsible leadership. And before my time at Accenture, many moons ago, I was a primary school teacher. So I have a background in education and a master's in education and international development. So that's me. Delighted to be here today, and thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you. Chris.
Yes, hi. Thanks again for the opportunity today. Great to be here. So yeah, my name is Chris Holmes. As Ian mentioned, I'm the Senior Vice President for Global Sourcing for Avantor, which essentially is a life science company. It's an American company with two main parts of it. One is a distribution business. So we're distributing life science products into labs, into big pharma companies, but also into scientific education, into high-tech industry as well. That's one part of the business. The other part is our own manufacturer. So we have both our own manufacturing and also then the distribution of brands. So it's interesting, the sort of two sides of the story, if you like, in that sense, and fascinating industry and sector to be in, actually. So yeah, look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Jan?
Kia ora, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak on the session. I work in a university, but I suppose I'm here today to maybe shed some light on the questions, drawing from a particular research project that I'm involved in, which is very applied in nature. So I'm part of a science advisory team to something called CBOS, which is the Seafood Businesses for Ocean Stewardship. So this is a group of companies that are extremely large, and we would call them keystone actors because they shape the whole system for seafood production, whether that be catching fish or making fish oils and feeds or feeding farm salmon, for example. And so, if you like, the circularity and the extent to which this cohort of companies feature across the whole of the supply chain of the seafood industry is quite important. And I will give you hopefully some useful examples of how that works in response to the theme of this session. So delighted to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, so let's kick things off quickly. I'd like kind of to get the panel's view on why is things like circular supply chain and this type of thing, why is it important for businesses? Maybe we'll start with Chris.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think from a business perspective, it's from a number of angles, I think, really. I mean, I think at a personal level, I think whatever importance we all attach to it individually, or from a children's perspective, for instance, different generations, But I think then as you go through the business, there's a number of areas where there's pressures from external, frankly. So from whether that's from the customer base, whether that's through sort of governmental or local regulations in that sense. But then there's also the company's own view of what's the right thing to do. And I think probably, certainly for the company I work for, in common with many others, the kind of whole SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that's something that I think most companies around the world probably in one way or another are embracing at the moment to whatever degree. And given there's 17 of those goals, inevitably companies are looking at different aspects and saying, well, which are the ones that we start with, which are the ones that we think are most relevant to us as a company, and then sort of setting their course from there. And they may say, okay, we focus on 5 or 6 at the beginning, and then we'll start to build out over time as we get more mature. Depending where you are on that life cycle of the journey, obviously. And there are other companies who may have been following that path for years and years before the SDGs even existed, or before it was, as you said earlier, industrial ecology. I'd never heard that term before, but that as you say, you've been interested in the subject for a long time. But so yeah, I think from a business perspective, it's a critical part of any business now, and I think there's not many companies that could say that they're not involved somehow or choose not to be involved somehow. So yeah, I think then it becomes, and we'll maybe get into it later, the questions of, well, what does that mean? What is it you're actually going to do? How are you going to go about it? Who are you going to involve? And obviously, from my point of view, coming from a procurement and sourcing background, happy to talk a bit about the kind of supply chain side of that, if you like, in terms of, well, what the implications are for how we deal with the businesses, the partners that work with us beyond our boundary as a firm, if you like, in that sense.
Do you have a kind of a favorite example of either supply chain or circular thinking that keeps coming back to you, and when you're thinking about this, where you go, wish I'd done that, or something that you have really achieved?
Yeah, it's interesting actually, and I'll go completely kind of off topic in a way, in that I'm passionate about skiing. And actually, when I went a few years ago to a circular event here, I live in Switzerland, and so went to an event in Basel about circular economy and fast fashion, which I knew nothing about. And afterwards, it got me really thinking about skiing, and I was going, well, hang on a second, what happens with all this ski stuff at the end of a season or at the end of its life? You know, so what happens to a pair of skis, a pair of boots, poles, all the things that go with ski gear? And there are some fantastic examples now where that's gone from, frankly, all ending up probably in landfill, and maybe, you know, some people make some stuff out of skis like Adirondack chairs and all that kind of stuff, but that's not the norm. Now you're getting companies that are making products from renewable materials in a way that they weren't before. You know, things that are based from even algae in terms of producing some of the polymers. People using castor beans as well for some of the kind of polyurethane, etc. And also centers for how things can be recycled, disassembled, recycled, or repurposed. And that didn't exist a few years ago. And that to me is interesting because it's a very complicated supply chain. You know, these things are ending up in ski towns, which typically are not close to big centers. So, you know, you're into that whole transport thing of, well, how do you get dead skis, if you like, dead boots? How do you get them back somewhere to be ground or repurposed or reused or recycled? So that to me is one that I keep in my mind all the time, because there aren't great answers to it yet. There's some shoots, but it's not a fully formed solution yet. And I like that because it's kind of constantly making me challenge when I think about the business I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. Well, how would we look at that differently? So yeah, that would probably be the example I'd start with.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different lenses to consider the question through, but in terms of why should businesses pay attention and what does it mean to be a circular business and to prioritize this agenda, I completely agree with Chris. It is the right thing to do as I think a first port of call, considering where we are in the decade to deliver, with 9 years left to deliver on the global goals. And essentially, you know, the current Earth's overshoot trajectory and all of the emissions crises we're facing and the number of other climate crises, it is the time where we need to really take stock and think about doing things in a different way. But in addition to that, I think what's really interesting about the circular economy is that it's actually a critical value driver for businesses as well. So Accenture have valued the opportunity at stake if we don't pivot to a more circular business model at $4.5 trillion by 2030. And that is completely massive. So I think
how many zeros is that?
Zeros upon zeros. And I think to think about that, and yeah, you're right though, Ian, it's beyond kind of comprehension. And thinking about, you know, there are so many different challenges that companies face in embedding circularity in their businesses and across their supply chains. And certainly it varies across industry, and, you know, very happy to talk to some of the challenges later, but I think the value is there and the opportunities are there, and we really are seeing leading practice happen. And there is definitely a step change in the engagement around this agenda, particularly even over the last couple of years. So I would say the value piece is huge, and thinking about the kind of the typical business drivers of value for circular. So depending on, you know, what your needs are as a company and what your maturity stage is in terms of your circular agenda, or, you know, the market that you sit in, circular can be a driver for new revenue streams. It can also be a cost reduction and reduction in costs. In addition to that, it can really reduce risk. And it's also a huge piece in terms of building brand and really leveraging kind of, you know, improved intangibles, you know, in terms of marketing and kind of your brand position, which is, you know, now more than ever so important when consumers are becoming more conscious. So that's really what I would say to build on what Chris has talked about in terms of the business value to be captured through good business and from deploying circular strategies. I don't know if I'm out of time. Shall I share one quick example of a company I love that I love to talk about?
Share away.
Great.
Share away.
So one of the companies that we have worked with through the Circulars Awards and in Accenture's work is Method, the household cleaning company. And I really love this example because Method are an example of kind of a almost fully circular loop. So they use bio-based inputs in their cleaning products. They use a lot of reusable and recyclable packaging in their packaging and in their products that they create. But also Method have created a soap factory in Chicago where on the top of the roof there is a 5,000 square foot farm that they're using where they're generating they have a climate controlled growing roof and solar tracking trees. So it's a fully kind of circular process. Their operations are circular as well. And they also hire locally. So I think another element of circular that sometimes we don't talk about as much is, you know, the social element and the regenerative nature for communities as well. So Method is a big thumbs up from my side.
It's fascinating stuff. The imagination, one of the things I find the circular economy, it really triggers innovation and creativity and makes people, you know, I think better and think differently. But so, Jan?
It's amazing, given that we've never met before and indeed are only virtually meeting now, is that I'd really like to build on Kathy's points on the value proposition, because I think there are three reasons why circular thinking is important. The first one is that any single company's performance is intimately tied to the performance of their supply chain. It's not something that sort of, as you said in the introduction, Ian, it's not something that happens, you know, out there somewhere else. And I'm particularly thinking of social risks. So in seafood, as with many other sectors, and Chris referred to clothing sector as well, there's some very, very poor labour practices off in the supply chain, and any amount of poor labour practice is salient. We'd often distinguish between something being material, that is that it matters in some sort of numerical way, but anyone caught in forced labor or very, very bad and unsafe labor practice is salient. It matters because it matters to the people who are affected by the harm. So any harm on your supply chain will inevitably translate through to the focal buying company, if you like, that's at the top of the supply chain process. The second thing then is that sorting out things further back in the supply chain is hugely synergistic. It does require attention, investment in time and thinking and gathering data and forming relationships and trusting relationships, but the ability to have a whole system benefit is definitely there. And we've found this with the seafood companies that we work with, not just only in their labor supply chains, but also in their raw materials supply chains. So if you want to go fast, people say go alone. If you want to go further, go together. And so actually working together with supply chain, but also with other peers in the industry and a combined supply chain makes a big difference. And those are two, really orientated towards a value proposition. The third reason why I think circularity is important is that we're moving from a position where you might expect an individual company to be responsible for its impacts, to be accountable to maybe environmental protection agencies or legal regulatory processes where they are. But we're moving from that responsibility focus to a stewardship focus. And if you are a steward of natural resources, and you're a steward of the regenerative capacity of the ecosystem, and if you're a social steward of the livelihoods that people have available to them in their countries and wherever they're working, then you are thinking about the whole supply chain. It's not an individual company point of view. So I think that stewardship move is so important, and stewardship sits behind the SDGs. It's right there about sustainable consumption and production. It's about decent work and sound economic growth. So the SDGs are a stewardship framework, and organizations are also increasingly seeing their role as part of the stewards of the system that generate great but also sometimes not so great outputs.
I think maybe if I could just quickly add something to that, because I really like that point, Jan. I think one of the beauties of the SDGs is it does really help to provide a framework way of looking at this. And if I think through my own kind of career in procurement, we've seen this kind of layering over the years of different risks that need to be addressed. And it feels like each time it's here's the next request, it's conflict minerals or it's labor or whatever it is, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just that as those things come individually, they're not seen as a whole. And I think that point about the stewardship and that point about the kind of how the SDGs provides that framework, I just think helps people position it better than looking at it in isolation and going, well, I need to talk about circularity, and then tomorrow I need to go and talk about slave labor, or whatever it is. So I think being able to put them all into that one framework is really helpful in terms of just getting people's thinking around it, frankly, in that sense, and opportunities, because as you look at one part, you realize that there's a connection somewhere else as well. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think it also speaks to what Kathy was saying as well about how do you create that value, how do you measure that value. Once you've got the connections, you can then start to place values on either the bad when you're not doing it, but also in terms of the good, and that creates that kind of push-pull dynamic, and that really, I don't know much more powerfully to articulate the kind of the benefits of these different systems, which exist, but just we often don't recognize or measure, or kind of in some ways are unthinkable, but they're no less real for that. Maybe if I can move on. So I think we'll all agree that it's got kind of great potential. And maybe if you just spend a few minutes thinking about some of the challenges, some of perhaps the sort of like the obstacles that are in the way of this, as kind of as a way to not just to say we can't do it, but actually to see how, you know, kind of like whether they can be overcome. And maybe start with you, Jan, in terms of don't know what example you want to take, but
I think I'd take one. I think the way I would see this is that we know we want to transform the whole system, but any one part of it's quite a difficult transformationary job. So I think one of the challenges, and circular thinking really helps this particular challenge, is that we want to simultaneously not only change the production activities of a particular firm in a particular place, we then want to change the bank's predisposition to risk and the way they might evaluate performance. We want to change the capital markets so that the markets themselves value strong sustainability performance and don't undermine that. Consumers need to be able to find a way, but also to express their preference for pro-social and pro-environmental behaviour and products of that nature through pricing, because it's no good saying I'd like a fabulous product, I'm not going to pay anything extra for it if it costs something more. And then the policy context within which organisations operate across the world and intersecting parts of the world need to line up as well. And in each one of those areas, we definitely see things moving. So markets are moving to provide better account for externalities. Policy contexts are moving to maybe price carbon in a more sensible way. Organisations are moving, but it's sort of like everything's moving in different ways, and it's where they mesh and get the whole system to move and step forward that's really quite important. And there is an extent to which, if you like, we'd like that sooner rather than later as well. And so there's sort of like, speed of the meshing needs to move quite quickly. So I think one of that main challenges is that everyone's doing their best with really good intention, but in their silos. It's about how that change actually translates across the whole system. And of course, that will sometimes generate dysfunctional effects. And so something that somebody does that thinks it's going to work well actually creates problems elsewhere. So I suppose that brings me to the second challenge, is having the data to be able to know what's happening. And that's, data is not cost-free. So an investment in understanding how the system works and how an action by one partner might affect others would also be really important. So I suppose that, that was two challenges in one, wasn't it? I was probably only allowed one, but I think the one is, we're transforming the whole system simultaneously. That's pretty tough.
Yeah, I think we can have as many challenges as we want. Whilst I'm an accountant, I'm not counting these things too much. But yeah, I think that message about the systemic nature and I think the collaboration and who pays, so that to actually to kick us from one system into another and keep us there. Chris, you want?
Sure. Yeah, and I'm glad you're not limiting us to one challenge, because I've got quite a few. But I think if I look at it, particularly from the kind of procurement and sourcing angle, so looking out of the company into our supply chain, and I'm someone that's really passionate about how we collaborate and innovate with our suppliers, and I think a big part of that is understanding the whole network, if you like, in that sense. It's not just about who's the person that supplies me, but obviously beyond that, and that becomes even more important when you're getting into some of the risk topics, but also obviously specifically here in terms of sustainability, circularity. So I think that piece that creates a challenge for us or for any company in terms of, well, how well do you truly know the whole supply chain, or do you really just know the people that you're paying an invoice to, if you like, in that sense. So I think that part, and that for me links into the skill set piece. And I was involved over the last couple of years running some events through the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. So I support that in the Swiss branch of that, living in Switzerland. And we ran two events over the last 2 years on circular economy. And the reason that I wanted to go after that topic was because I figured that probably most people in procurement sourcing, and a sweeping generalization, but probably didn't know too much about circular in that sense. And so we ran it in conjunction with an organization called the Impact Hub, who are focused on circular economy transition. And there's one here in Basel. So we partnered with them to run the event. And it absolutely pointed out this part that said, look, the skill set for procurement and sourcing folks has to dramatically change, because you can't anymore just say, you know what, I buy this stuff, and then actually, you know what happens once it leaves us? Not my problem. Well, now it is your problem. And you know, that is a fundamental shift. And again, there'll be some industries where they always had that view for whatever reason, but I would guess that most industries, you know, that once it left their doors, it wasn't going to be their problem. And I think now that piece of, okay, so what do you do with that product? How do you get it back either to us or to another agent, if you like, in that sense, depending on the product, etc. I think that part is a fundamental shift for how procurement and sourcing folks think about their supply chains. And I think the third one I would say probably is also this piece of assessing total cost, because to Jan's point, one of the things I think we have to break actually is this mentality that says, you know what, if you're buying something circular, it's going to be more expensive. I don't buy that. There's an element where, yeah, there will be cases where that's the case, but back to the point of innovation and collaboration, I think there are massive opportunities when you start digging into it, that it creates a totally different way of making something or of delivering something, or you know, whatever it is. And so I think we have to break that mindset, not just in procurement and sourcing. It's those kind of mindsets are everywhere in that sense. It says, well, you know what, it's always going to be more expensive. I don't think so. I hope not. Anyway, that's for sure. But no, it's definitely opportunity from a procurement and sourcing point of view. From that point of view. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we have this big problem, but actually it comes down to an individual as well. Somewhere along the line, people are sitting together making decisions based on the information that they've actually got ahead of them. So I think it's really nice to take these big global heroic challenges, but actually, you know, there's an everyday reality that needs to be addressed as well.
Definitely.
As Jan said, at the same time, but before it or after it, or because the time and the rhythm of change is important as well. Kathy, I suspect from your program that you've been lead on, you have confronted many of these challenges.
Yeah, I think certainly how we typically look at it is, and there are, you're right, and to build on what Chris and Jan have already said, you know, there are so many different lenses to look at these challenges through. They are very much systemic, and there are so many different actors that need to be playing at the same time, and for kind of pre-competitive alliances almost to make some of these really systemic changes happen. And typically, if we looked at it from a client perspective, what we would say is there are almost 4 buckets across which the challenges of an organization would typically sit. And we would say that we would encourage, say, an emerging player who's keen to start thinking about how to embed circular in their business, to think about their operations first and to think about where they can make their operations more circular. So that might be looking at their emissions, their energy use, their water, and their operational waste, for example. It could be thinking about if they use large assets, you know, thinking about how often those assets lie idle, for example. But there are so many different challenges that are industry specific. It's actually quite hard to have to roll it up in one view. After the operational piece, we would then talk to clients about kind of their products and services and how to actually make a product more circular. And certainly in the Circulars Accelerator, we've really seen across the value chain disruptors changing how products are, the inputs that go into designing a product. And then actually the really interesting piece that I find is completely transforming how people engage with those products and services. So rethinking how you go to market with your business. You know, is it a sharing service? Can you actually operate your product as a service and through a sharing platform? how can you extend the life of your product again and again, or how can you repatriate that value back into the value chain at the end of its life? So I suppose that's the second piece. And then really would completely agree with Chris on the culture and the talent piece, and having the right people at every level of an organization to drive systemic change internally is really hard. And it's so important to be able to hire for that skill set, and also to champion circularity at every level. And there are ways of incentivizing that. And then completely agree with the ecosystem piece and kind of the importance of, as I mentioned, the pre-competitive alliance. And a really nice example of that is Levi, you know, the jeans company, and they've actually, they have a denim finishing process, and they've actually made that open source because I think it's called Waterless, or Smart Waterless, I think it's called, and it uses 96% less water than it typically uses. I think it's something like over 3,000 litres of water are needed to finish a pair of jeans. And Levi have made this open source so that anybody operating in this space can use that denim finishing. And I think it's those sorts of moves that we really need to see, because yeah, the world and its ecosystem is ripe for transformation, but only through kind of cross collaboration and innovation is that going to happen. And I could talk for hours about this, but just I think a final thing is just not to underestimate, I suppose, the role of technology. And we really are in the fourth industrial revolution, and we talk about like 27 actually technologies that can enable a quicker transition. So the exciting thing, despite all of these challenges, we're at a time now where we actually are seeing the technological advances to make this shift happen. So it's about kind of getting the buy-in across the ecosystem, but you know, there is momentum and it is growing. So not all doom and gloom, which is good.
The idea of kind of technology as an issue, and I know, Jan, that we've talked about in the CBOS, they were talking about kind of blockchain for not quite individual fish, but close to individual fish, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I think in seafood, I think there's two pieces of the technology, I think that's really coming to the fore. One is to enhance traceability, so you know where it's been in your supply chain, and you know what kind of conditions, where the fish have passed through on the supply chain. But then it's also technology, particularly in food, is particularly in feeds, and how to get feeds low carbon, but also with the smallest amount of fish that you need in feeds to feed to other fish. And this is where I suppose it's kind of speaks to some of Chris's interests, that genetic technology and the use of gene editing in order to be able to bring certain kinds of things that are good for food. You can tell I'm not a scientist in this respect, but to be able to make the feeds really good for human health when they've been fed to farm salmon, for example. So I think there is technology in terms of innovation of how we do food, but then also how we know where things have been. And certainly for some seafood, like tuna, is hugely high value. So actually to track and trace is a non-trivial task, but it is one that can yield benefit. And the good thing about traceability technologies, and there's blockchain's one, but there's many other ones as well, is that it also allows you to capture something of the labour that's been involved in the production of the materials that are being passed through. And I mean, CBOS is a producer consortium, so they, if you like, are the people who are making the food, and then it heads off. So a supermarket's perspective would be quite different, because I'll be seeing the companies that I work with are up their supply chain in that respect. But information going across that supply chain is hugely important.
Yeah, some of the research that we're doing on sort of electric vehicles are finding that already businesses are using kind of different forms of kind of distributed ledger technologies for that traceability, but attaching things like carbon emissions, use of labour, accreditations on the way. Yes. It's very much a change, because often we find that in information systems, we gather all sorts of information within an organization, and then we suddenly just collapse it and send an invoice with about 5 or 6 details on it, and we destroy all that kind of that data that's connectable. Then we go into other organization, we start building up all this data, and then we sell it and we collapse it down into like a single invoice. And all the time there's all this punctuated, delightful kind of like information for traceability that we're actually disabling.
Yes.
You know, it's not there. We're disabling and find a way to do that.
Yeah. And certainly the companies that I work with are partnered very closely with something called the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability. So they're building sort of like, you know, data platforms that are standard, so things can be passed along from one company to another, because they're using the same key data elements, and that they're measured in ways that are standardized, and so hence you are communicating the same information along the line. So there's quite a bit of, you know, data science sitting behind a lot of these things as well.
I think what's interesting about the fish example is that we often don't. Fish is relatively perishable. I know we can feed, but it's relatively sort of perishable. Yet if we can actually track something as perishable as fish, you know, the solutions are out there, and I think it's interesting. I think the idea as well of some of these things we don't think, you know, so Levi's, there's an example there of washing. Now there's many other businesses that wash, and they're connected through their washing. They're connected through different ways, and often we think that businesses are so different. But actually, some of the fundamental activities and processes are connectable. And if we imagine that we could put the best possible solution every time somebody washes, every time somebody stores, every time somebody kind of like captures the data, the transformation is enormous. But it does require that.
Just to weigh in slightly on that, I completely agree with you, Ian, and thinking about, I guess, the cross-industry application of these technologies. As you say, it might start in one industry, but it's so replicable in other contexts. And we're seeing that with the Circulars accelerators. So the 17 companies that we're supporting through a process of kind of overcoming some barriers to scale. We're seeing some companies, you know, for example, there's one in Africa who offers cold storage as a service. So, you know, kind of large refrigerators, freezers, to prevent smallholder farmers from kind of losing out on post-harvest so losses, to minimize losses. And there's been, you know, discussions to explore how could we use that for, you know, vaccinations, or, you know, so there's so many other ways in which a technology can start somewhere, a disruptor can start in one industry, and it can really, you know, replicate. And I think the replicability of some of these solutions is what it makes it so exciting. So just to add that point, would completely agree with you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and it's moving, isn't it? Moving. It's the thinking like our product is cool, our product is warm, our product is clean. You know, these different kind of adjectives, you know, in the way in which you look at things, and I think that in some ways was really transformative, and particularly I think in the dematerialization movement, where people, I think it was kind of Kathy talked about this idea, you stop buying a thing and you buy the function and the service. That's what you really need. You know, it's like we don't buy electricity for ownership. You know, I don't know if there might be some people who collect electricity. If there are, I do apologize. But normally we do it for what it does for us. You know, we don't have those things there. But that transformative thinking. I did promise I would try and keep things about questions to do, and I think we're already in that space, but I think it'd be interesting to get some insights into how, you know, businesses who are either thinking about moving into kind of circular supply chain response, you know, kind of procurement, or who have started it and want to kind of like to move on to the next level. If we've got some kind of bits of insight, some real kind of key kind of ideas that would really help people kind of either start the journey or kind of transform their kind of pathway. Maybe Chris, do you want to kick this one off?
Sure. Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I think, and we touched probably on one or two of the kind of elements as we've been going through. I think there's an element of, what's if you're working in a business, what's the tone from the top? What is the messaging about what your company is going to try and achieve? And then, how do you tailor whatever you're going to do in your function to support that? How does it fit with the priorities? How do you drive it forward? And I think that piece, getting that connection into the language of the business is really important, because otherwise you run the risk with any sort of topic like this of being kind of on the periphery. It's kind of like, well, these enthusiasts who are going off and doing this stuff, but it bears no sort of relevance to what the company mission is. So I think, as I said earlier, more and more companies have it as part of their mission anyway, to some degree, in that sense. So tuning the message, understanding what is it that the company truly wants to go after, and then thinking about, okay, what does that translate into the particular area you're in. And then obviously for procurement and sourcing folks, particularly then thinking about, well, okay, what does that look like externally? And to give you an example, actually, in the business that I'm in, given a big part of our business is this distribution business. So buying branded products and distributing those, acting as a kind of point of aggregation, if you like, in that sense, a point of expertise. The last thing we want to do is kind of be going out to our supply base in a sort of fairly traditional way, if you like, and saying, right, well, here's our code of conduct. You need to sign up to that because obviously you're our supplier. Therefore, you need to follow our goals. And given that we're buying from large established brands, you kind of go, actually, you know what, we need to be a bit more humble in that request. They're going to be doing a lot of stuff themselves already. And it's not helpful when large buyers then come along and say, no, it has to look like this. So I think we need a lot more kind of agility and flexibility when it comes to that part. So I think for individuals, again, it's about understanding the supply chain, understanding where the opportunities lie, and also, what would it look like programmatically over a period of time? It's not a kind of 1 year and done for sure, because clearly nobody's going to fix any of these things within a year. But also it needs to be a sustained program so that again, it follows the business and helps drive the business in that sense. And particularly to Kathy's point earlier on, where it's driving top line opportunity as well. Because clearly, again, speaking the language of the business, connecting into the top line growth goal for sure somewhere in the business. So if there are things that you can do that help link into that, then it just helps to get the story going. It helps to build the kind of credibility around what you're doing. And that piece is really important, as I say, otherwise you end up sort of just as a silo or on the periphery that people kind of going, yeah, not sure what those crazy guys are doing, but sure, it's interesting. But and it's obviously so much more than that. But yeah, so I think that's probably where I'd start.
I often kind of imagine it like, imagine there's a documentary on Netflix about your supply chain suddenly. How worried would you be if suddenly you heard it coming on that? Anyway, Kathy, do you want to go next, and then we'll move on to Jan?
Yeah, and I think I definitely build on what Chris has mentioned. I think for somebody starting, it really depends again on kind of, I guess, the maturity of their circular journey. But if you were an organization starting and thinking about how you can begin to embed circularity, I think something Chris mentioned earlier about actually thinking about it from kind of the top down but the bottom up is really important, because there are pockets of innovation happening across companies often that people are not aware of. So it's maybe about kind of doing a bit of a scan across your organization to understand what's going on. Are there some existing initiatives that actually fall into the bucket of circular, but people don't even realize that they do? And, what are the successes of those, and can they be scaled? So that might be a first port of call, thinking about how can we make things more efficient, thinking about those drivers again of cost, or, a reduction in cost, or, a new revenue stream, or something like improving your brand, for example, as well. So really thinking about what would drive you to implement circular businesses and business models or practices, beyond the fact that it is, of course, the right thing to do. It's part of a blueprint to rebuild for better. I think it is really, the time is really ripe. You know, the transformation is, COVID has laid bare, I suppose, that we've talked at length about it, but some of the inefficiencies and beyond that, the dangers of supply chains at the moment. And we've never seen that more than in the last year. So there really is a growing impetus to move on this. And I think where there may not have been investor pressure before or consumer pressure before, there are so many things that are pushing companies to really consider this, both for the positive societal and economic, environmental benefits, but indeed the economics as well. So I would probably say take a pulse on where you are at the moment, what's going on in your organization, and then think across, you know, as I said, your operations, your products, and then before you even begin to think about kind of the broader piece of how you engage externally, try and get it right, maybe internally first. Because that's not an easy challenge, as we know for sure. It's very complex. That's probably what I'd say.
Okay, thank you very much. Jan?
I think I have two tricks in my bag on this one. The first trick, I think, is to look for equivalence rather than standardization. So partly because lots of people are enthusiastic about whether it be, you know, reporting in your supply chain or, you know, providing information about, you know, where the goods have come from or whatever. So sometimes that sort of leads to a proliferation of having to actually respond to several you know, buyers' requests for information. And so wherever you can, building an equivalence. So if, for example, you're disclosing information into the Carbon Disclosure Project about your supply chain carbon, that is a really good equivalence for all sorts of other information flows elsewhere. So figuring out what information is equivalent to what other information, and therefore only having to supply one set of information. The second thing that you see in particularly in supply chains, and I'm thinking of an example of a really interesting paper that some colleagues of mine at Lancaster have produced. They were looking at auditing clothing supply chains for forced labour potential problems. And so what they did is, instead of doing a traditional sort of audit from an accounting perspective, they did a focused collaborative audit. So more than one supplier coming together with an NGO to talk to a supplier about how they could support them to learn that everyone could learn. So instead of two single visits that were really focused on compliance, a collaborative learning audit where the whole system is built in its capacity to do better. So again, it's I suppose I'm you know, in everything I've said today, I've sort of really focused on, you know, joining hands with other people and doing things well together is likely to improve, again, the whole system as well as each individual element to it.
Yeah,
it's a great point, Jan, about the auditing, actually, because I think again, when you look at all the multi dimensions of risk, then each one potentially leads to a different audit if you're not careful, and we end up in these situations where you've got companies in the same sector auditing the same supplier for you know, any multitude of risks, and you kind of look at that and say, look, again, could that not be done more collaboratively? And certainly in say the pharmaceutical supply chain, that's something where they have tried to come together and reduce that. But it's extremely difficult, you know, against with competing companies, you know, to get them all to agree to the same standard, you know, that's incredibly difficult. But I think those opportunities are definitely there as well, because otherwise we create an industry of auditing, which is also anyway not the spiritual intent of it, if you like, in that sense. So it's yeah, definitely that's another one of the challenges, to go back to an earlier question, probably. But,
yes.
Yeah.
But it's also, and I think with the seafood example, I mean, I'm a representative of a group of scientists who are trying to generate insight and evidence to help a cohort of companies to do better. So that sort of whole, you know, science academia intersection, how that's managed, but also how, if you like, the activities of those of us who research and understand, you know, many different systems can be brought together to support people collectively is also important, and is our responsibility as researchers and members of, you know, sort of the scientific community, to be able to have the impact by making information available, by translating information for people, about helping people do that better. So it's also about the good quality knowledge brokers in the academy, as well as in industry associations and in other sectors as well.
Mm.
I think there's a kind of, I'm getting a sense that the universities, as that is their role, have a responsibility, I think, to kind of step up in the space. And certainly I kind of take, I think Chris's point from earlier is that we need to be teaching our students this stuff now, so that they when they leave, they have that propensity to learn with the kind of basic knowledge, and maybe even drive change. Okay, I'm sadly kind of time is getting towards towards beating us, if you like, in that kind of context. But I'd just like give people opportunity and to one thing that you wish could happen that could be really, really transformative in terms of making a difference, and taking all of the kind of the potential of all of the things that we've actually talked about, and actually kind of like move it from just ideas into kind of to practice and to transform. So if we had one thing, and it can be a policy thing, or it can be, and just open the mind, what would it be? So and I'll do this by acclamation. So who wants to go first on this one?
I'll go first. I'm starting to hear people talk about regenerative capitalism. I don't entirely know what that is, but it attracts me in a really sort of positive way, because quite often we say, well, let's try to clean up the mess and not do anything worse. Whereas in fact, to build an economic system that's regenerative by design, I think would be really great. And I know that John Elkington, his book on Green Swans, is trying to think about what that might be. I suspect that's stewardship in the language that I use in my work with the CBOS companies, but I'd love to know what a regenerative capitalist system looks like.
I'll probably slightly cheat, and this will become two actually, but I think that at the sort of bottom up level, I think there's definitely this piece about that we touched on earlier, about the shift in mindset, attitude, thinking about how we think about supply chains. So that kind of ecosystem view, for want of a better term, looking at it in its entirety, holistically, the total cost element of it. I think that shift, and it's not just about procurement and supply chain, that's a company mindset, I think is massive. I think at the sort of, if you like, top down level, I think the other piece though is ultimately governmental, because, and I don't know whether carbon tax is the right answer, but I think, it doesn't feel like governments are truly taking it seriously to some degree. That's probably not entirely fair thing to say, but the thinking is still too short term, and companies, individuals can do a lot of stuff on their own, but ultimately, if governments aren't going to truly drive this through policy, then yeah, I wonder how far we can get on our own, and I just don't know, to be honest. So that's I'm now feeling like I'm really closing on a really downbeat note. But anyway, that wasn't my intent. But yeah, I think that piece is going to be critical.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think seeing change in policy like the EU Green Deal and, for example, and the Circular Economy Action Plan within that does bode well. I think that there is so much more to be done, beyond some of this, when we're looking at, I guess, regulation around extended producer responsibility, or discrete design directives, etc. I think it's heartening to see the shift in the emphasis on these areas within circular and beyond in policy. But I agree. I think there needs to be so much more to really accelerate the transition. What I would actually love to see is, it's been so heartening over the last year, 2 years, to see so many companies make, you know, these huge commitments, these moonshot goals to 2030, 2050. But I think now it's really about holding those companies to accountability for the commitments that they've made. And what I would love to see is the investment that those companies make to make those ambitions a reality starting to happen. And I suppose putting their stake in the ground of how to do business better, how to be responsible business leaders for tomorrow. So I think commitments are a huge first step, but they're not enough either. And I would love to see the investment and kind of the money going behind some of those big announcements being made over the next couple of years.
Okay, wonderful. I would just like to thank everyone for their contribution. I think it's been an incredibly rich kind of wide-ranging discussion, where we've gone from the kind of the small level to the kind of the big picture and back again, and in particular, and a kind of fascinating circular discussion of kind of circular thinking, which is actually good, because it means that we have kind of like started to address not just the individual challenges, but the different ways of kind of thinking and acting. So thank everyone, and for what has been a kind of a wonderful discussion, and I'm sure we'll kind of trigger many different kind of actions and many different kind of thinkings for kind of business, and the start of what is a really important kind of transition. So thank you.